In photosynthesis, the light is the first source of energy. Most people think it's the only source, and while it is important, chemicals like ATP and NADPH are as equally vital to the cell. But more on those chemicals in a second. As everyone from a first grader knows, photosynthesis starts with the light of the sun hitting the leaf of the plant. But the leaf doesn't automatically produce energy. Shocker, right? Of course, there's a long process with difficult names to pronounce that eventually produce sugar. Before we get into the entire process of photosynthesis, we need to do a little dissection of the plant itself. So all living things are made of cells, and it turns out so are plants. In fact, within the plant cells are little machines called organelles that allow the cell to function. That machine is called a chloroplast. The chloroplast is responsible for the whole system of photosynthesis. So how does the chloroplast do such a big job? Well, I'm glad you asked. Within a chloroplast, there's an even tinier machine that lives in stacks called grana. The individual machine, though, is a thylakoid. A thylakoid is a lot like one pancake, and a grana is a stack of pancakes. But don't forget the syrup, which in the thylakoid is called the stroma, and it is the liquid-like substance that encases the areas within the chloroplast. So with the brief anatomy lesson over, we can get on to the next step. That next step is when the water that was soaked up from the earth is broken down by the energy from the sunlight. The water is broken down into three parts, 2 H+ ions, 1 oxygen, and 1 electron, per 1 molecule of water. The H+ ions and oxygen are released into the inner space of the thylakoid, while the electrons are pushed onto a train, or as it's more commonly known as, an electron transport chain. This overall step is known as photosystem 2. As the electrons continue on their designated path, their negative charge pulls positive H+ ions from the stroma into the thylakoid space, which leaves them exhausted. But don't worry, the electrons then reach photosystem 1, where the light also hits. The light then recharges the electrons and sends them on their way. Side note, if you're wondering why photosystem 2 comes before photosystem 1, it's because scientists love to confuse you. No, just kidding. It's because photosystem 1 was discovered before photosystem 2. After photosystem 1 recharges the electrons, they travel to the end of the electron transport chain and into the stroma where it meets the dwindling H+ ion. Speaking of which, remember all those H+ ions that were flooding into the thylakoid space? Well, it turns out there's not an unlimited supply. But there's a process to fix that and create energy along the way. It's called ATP synthase. ATP synthase can be most related to a turbine. Instead of air that's pushing the turbine, it's H+ ions going out into the stroma to join the rest of its kind. But what the H+ ions don't know is that they are creating energy to store in the transference of ADP to ATP, which is also known as chemiosmosis. Adenine triphosphate, or ATP, is a short-term fix for storing energy. But why only a short-term fix? Because ATP comes from ADP, or adenine diphosphate, and the energy from ATP synthase is stored in a bond with a third phosphate, which is unstable and unable to hold energy for long periods of time. Recall all the H+ ions in the stroma from ATP synthase and all the electrons in the stroma for photosystem 1? Well, they have an important purpose. They too create a bond that stores energy for a little while. A chemical called NADP+, along with electrons and H+ ions, will create another chemical called NADPH that will travel with ATP to the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle, or light-dependent reaction, was first discovered by this scientist named Melvin Calvin. The Calvin cycle's purpose is to produce long-term energy storage for the plant. Overall, it looks like this, but we'll go step by step. The first step is carbon fixation. 6 carbon dioxide molecules are introduced into the circle and join with 6 5-carbon molecules. That equals out to 12 3-carbon molecules and 12 oxygen. The next step is reduction. 12 ATP come into the cycle and break the third phosphate bond. 12 NADPH come and do the same thing. After that, 2 3-carbon molecules break off to make sugar. Lastly, 10 3-carbon molecules change to 6 5-carbon molecules with the help of ATP.